We don't fight racism with racism. We fight racism with solidarity.
But we're not just up against the police. We are up against an entire system that prioritizes profits and oppression over people.
We are up against a worldwide system of oppression and exploitation.
We need a powerful socialist movement to end all capitalist oppression and exploitation.
In einem separaten Jitsi-Raum statt. Den Link schicke ich hier in den Chat und auch weitere technische Hinweise. Genau, und es ist noch wichtig zu erwähnen, dass diese Veranstaltung auf unterschiedlichen Kanälen ausgestrahlt wird. Also der Auftakt und die erste Fragerunde, zu der ich gleich noch was sage, wird auf YouTube und auf Facebook auch gestreamt und die gemeinsame Diskussion findet dann nur noch im Zoom-Raum hier statt und die Streams werden beendet. Genau. Ihr könnt, während Steve redet, schon Fragen in den Chat schreiben und die werden wir dann im Anschluss vorlesen und er kann sie beantworten und dann starten wir gemeinsam in die Diskussion. So, im Chat steht jetzt alles, was ihr wissen müsst und das heißt, jetzt kann ich Steve das Wort übergeben und du kannst starten. Bitte schön.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak here. Obviously, we know, living as we do in the belly of the beast, in the most, if you like, dangerous capitalist country in the world, that socialists and activists around the world, you keep a close eye on developments in the US. And although it's something that's said every 4 years, without exception in the US, 2020 really is an historic general election, matching the historic crisis facing working class people and poor people in this country. In the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, official figures show that already 8 million Americans have been pushed into poverty. Tens of millions have maxed out their credit cards to pay the rent. Official unemployment figures count 8% people out of work, although the real figure is probably at least double that. The COVID-19 pandemic continues largely out of control, going into a third wave of infections. In Illinois, where I live, the death rate is over 80 per 100,000 of population, with 25 to 30 deaths occurring every day. We're number 10, in Illinois is number 10 in per capita deaths, despite a relatively consistent lockdown policy and mask wearing in public places. The deaths are heavily concentrated in neighborhoods of color, which means low incomes and other indications of social deprivation. Nationally, over 230,000 people have died so far, and that number is expected to approach 500,000 by the end of the year. These factors contributed to creating a massive sense of urgency around the election. A record early turnout saw over 100 million ballots cast nationwide before Election Day. The state of Texas saw more early votes cast than all of the total votes that were cast in 2016. We've now seen the highest percentage turnout of a presidential election in over a century and the highest ever in absolute numbers. This was supposed to create a tidal blue wave that would sweep Biden into office and turn the Senate into a Democratic majority. But as we speak, the best the Democrats can hope for is a 50-50 Senate, while the presidential race is still in the balance. So we need to look at the reasons why. And I want to read you a quote from the New Yorker from a few days ago. Towards the end of the 2016 presidential campaign, a political canvasser working in the predominantly Black community of Newtown in Sarasota, Florida, talked to a young man, engaged him in conversation. "Why should I register to vote?" this young Black man said. "Ain't nothing happened for me in the last 8 years." Barack Obama's 2 terms, the 2 terms of the first Black president in American history, were followed by a historic decline in voter turnout among Black people. And Donald Trump carried Florida by over 100,000 votes 4 years ago, and again this year. Joe Biden offered nothing to working class and poor Americans except the fact that he wasn't Donald Trump. That's the main takeaway in this election. Even though Biden said, when pressed on the debate stage, that he supported some progressive changes, for example, it was teased out of him that he supports a $15 federal minimum wage, which at this point would only bring the minimum back into line with what it was maybe 15 to 20 years ago, nowhere near what it would take to make it a living wage. He never campaigned on it. He never campaigned on a stimulus package for the pandemic that would have included a continuation of the $600 a week unemployment top-up, which kept millions from being evicted from their homes this spring and summer, or on any clear political program other than that he would somehow do better than the worst president in living memory. To show the gap that this created, consider this. 2 days ago in Florida, a $15 minimum wage law, which a few years ago would have been unthinkable, passed with almost 2/3 of the vote, but Joe Biden couldn't even get to 50%. So this absolutely proves that progressive demands are supported. Biden is not seen as part of those progressive demands. In a Fox News exit poll on Election Day, 72% of voters said they wanted a government-run healthcare program, such as almost all other advanced industrialized countries. And yet Biden, in order to reassure the Wall Street investors has repeatedly said that he would veto Medicare for all, even if it was brought to his desk after having been passed in both houses. Throughout the campaign, Biden acted as though he was entitled to the support of a majority of Americans, and his strategy was literally to hide out in his own basement while Trump made a fool of himself. And although Trump mostly obliged, his first debate performance was disastrous, as have been all of his press conferences on the subject of the pandemic.
5 minutes.
Trump was judged to have won the second debate with lines like, "Joe, you've been in Washington for 47 years. What exactly have you done?" And that was exactly the right thing for any candidate running against Biden to say. Biden massively outspent Trump, but the money went on consultants and TV advertising. His lack of a ground game was blamed on the pandemic, but it most likely came down to an echoing lack of volunteers to do the work, the complete opposite of Bernie's campaign. Where the Democrats did have a ground game, as in Maricopa County, Arizona, it was incredibly effective. But that was the legacy of a completely different business, an immigrant rights battle that developed locally over the past decade in the Latino community there. The Biden campaign had nothing to do with it. They just benefited from it. Similarly, in Nevada, where the Culinary Workers Labor Union have a powerful organization in Las Vegas. And as I mentioned above, Biden is rightly haunted by the lingering effects of the Obama-Biden term in office, during which Black Americans' assets fell at the highest rate since slavery. Biden thought he would be swept in by a suburban landslide in a conscious move to take over the Republican base so that he would owe nothing to the urban working class. But the Trump narrative of cities out of control during the Black Lives Matter uprising fed into suburban fears of urban riots and was not countered by Biden's more mainstream, almost echoing of the same idea, just a more liberal version of it, saying that instead of the cops shooting people dead, they should shoot them in the legs, and by unconditionally condemning looting. The fact that he didn't have to do this to win votes is showed by the fact that a majority of Americans thought that the burning of the Minneapolis police station after the murder of George Floyd was justified in the days after it happened. But the main story of the election is that Trump's insane response to the pandemic and his overall history of unpredictable behavior, his pandering to the far right, his attacks on civil rights, labor rights, women's rights, and the environment created a massive social polarization which drove up turnout on both sides of the political divide to record levels. As a result, the mediocre, faltering, and forgettable Biden has broken Barack Obama's record for the most votes ever won in a presidential election. And because the working class majority still leans towards the traditional party that orients itself, however grudgingly, towards working class issues, and because there is no choice of an actual workers' party available, because the Democrats do everything they can to prevent that, this will probably see him elected. And if he's not elected, it'll be because of the undemocratic electoral college that was set up by the slave-owning founders of the United States. There is a question as to what will happen to Trump if he's defeated. There is a liberal line that says that Trump is now invaluable to the Republicans, that he's going to play an important role going forward. Personally, I think this is very doubtful. He's already being abandoned by the Republican leadership because he's losing. None of them supported his doubling down rhetoric over the last few months or his appalling performance on the pandemic. And also he faces years of lawsuits without the protection of being in the presidency and having the Justice Department at his beck and call. A lot has already been said about the polls being wrong. I don't think there's much point in dwelling on that, but they were still an indication. Before the election, Joe Biden maintained a polling lead of 6 to 10% since clinching the Democratic Party nomination in April. But in most of the battleground states, in Florida, Texas, Ohio, Iowa, North Carolina, and Georgia, the polls were the equivalent of a coin flip, and then that has been borne out. In 2016, going to their messages, Trump's message in 2016 was "Make America Great Again," through support for protectionist trade measures, coupled with attacks on immigrants, and a rhetoric about bringing back factory jobs to the Midwest, which didn't happen, by the way. This was enough to win by very narrow margins in those states that got him past 270 electoral votes in 2016. And just as a reminder, he never came close to winning the popular vote, with Clinton 3 million votes ahead.
Could you speak a little bit
This
more?
year, Trump failed to come up with a coherent strategy. His response to the BLM uprising was to put himself forward as a candidate of law and order. As I pointed out, this did have a certain effect, but it never really took off, leaving him campaigning mostly on the economy, which before the pandemic was still in very slowly job-creating mode that began under Obama.
Steve, can you talk a little bit slower, please?
Biden wanted to be and was seen as the candidate of going back to normal, whatever normal might be. This was aimed at what used to be the Republican base, suburban, white, and middle or working class people who are not daily facing poverty and deprivation, and who have a minimal connection to politics, other than the idea that your job as a citizen is to go to vote every 4 years. And Biden is the more reliable, the more predictable candidate of big business. What stands between him, though, or any Democrat, and the full-throated endorsement of most sections of the capitalist class is that he depends on the votes of working class people and the support of the labor movement and social justice organizations, who, despite their leaders' overwhelming support for capitalism and the undemocratic structures of the so-called Democratic Party, are subject to the pressure of their base. In other words, the problem for big business is the raised expectations that a Biden presidency will bring. Other than that, Wall Street and big business have no doubts as to Biden's loyalty to their system, which he has proved during his entire term in office, 47 years as a pro-business corporate candidate. The pro-business online newsletter Axios explained Biden's post-election strategy a few days ago, and it's been borne out. Here's what they said. If news organizations declare Joe Biden the mathematical president-elect, he plans to address the nation as its new leader, even if President Trump continues to fight in court. Biden advisors learned the lesson of 2000, when Al Gore hung back while George W. Bush declared victory in that contested election, putting the Democrat on the defensive while Bush acted like the winner. So if Biden is declared the winner, he'll begin forming his government and looking presidential. Biden plans to adopt what one confidant called a healing tone and begin talking about the path forward in battling the coronavirus. And by the way, this is exactly what he did yesterday at about 4 o'clock Central Time. So the transition, Biden had 8 years in the White House, and he's surrounded by aides with decades of government experience. So the transition has made agency by agency preparations for him to take office. But here's what Axios also said. Look for Biden to send all business signals. He won't pack the courts and is unlikely to push for repeal of the Senate's filibuster rule and its 60-vote requirement anytime soon. Instead, look for Biden to push to pass as much as possible under the banner of budget reconciliation, which requires just a simple majority. In other words, a business as usual president. And also, it's worth noting that reports from Bernie delegates who attended the Democrats' virtual convention are that the Biden campaign operatives were even more ruthless and insulting towards the Bernie delegates than were Hillary's operatives 4 years ago. So that's some indication of the attitude of the potential Biden administration towards the left. In the debates with Trump, Biden repeatedly emphasized that he is the one who beat the socialist. He's literally representing himself as the most effective bulwark against socialism, implying that he will tame us where Trump only provoked us. So I want to turn to talking about the political consciousness of the young and working people that socialist alternative has been trying to engage with during this election. Undoubtedly, the overwhelming desire to get Trump out of office translated into significant, though passive, support for Joe Biden on the left and in Black, Latinx, and other oppressed communities. The complete capitulation of Bernie Sanders back in April left an enormous vacuum on the left, with Bernie himself and most of his surrogates, like AOC, fading into the background noise of pro-Biden pundits. The high youth turnout suggests that the tens of thousands of young people, teenagers, and people in their early 20s, who were among the 23 million people who took to the streets to confront police brutality and systemic racism following the murder of George Floyd back in the summer, that most of these people embraced the argument that their votes had to be used to stop Trump. And we don't agree that that was the correct thing to do with their votes. But with skillful tactics and a transitional approach, we know that we can recruit from this huge layer of young people. We knew that they would vote for Joe Biden on the 3rd and meet us, our members in cities across the country, at the demonstrations that we were the first to call for, and in some cases led yesterday on the 4th. Our whole section turned towards building demonstrations that pointed towards mass action. Should Trump try and steal the election, or whether Biden ended up winning on or shortly after election night, we had slogans that were prepared for either eventuality. In either case, our job was to intervene and support immediate action to defend democracy, to defend the democratic right to vote, and for all the votes to be counted, while pointing to what will ultimately defeat Trumpism, namely a new workers' party.
Steve, can you still speak a little bit?
The position of the great majority of the left has been to vote for Biden on election day.
Please, a little bit slower, Steve, and you have 15 minutes gone.
So for the great majority of the left, their position has been allegedly to vote for Biden on election day and hold his feet to the fire, that's the expression that is used, to somehow pressure him to move to the left after he's elected. We don't agree with this position. This is part of a long-standing left strategy which DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, despite its rapid growth and use of socialist rhetoric, bases itself on. It's what they call the Dem insider, the Democrat insider perspective, which, in my view, focuses on taking on the Democratic Party leadership within its undemocratic structures, which effectively means postponing taking on the main enemy, the ruling class itself, until the left somehow controls this bourgeois party, which they will never, ever do. So instead of engaging with the ruling class itself, the left spends, that part of the left that goes into the Democratic Party spends enormous energies on shadow boxing the proxies of big business within the Democratic Party. Our strongest counter-argument is the facts that we in Socialist Alternative have created on the ground in Seattle. Despite having only one elected representative so far, Shama Sawant, we have used that one elected office to build mass campaigns for the $15 minimum wage, for affordable housing, and to tax the rich. And in that sense, we are directly taking on big business. In the process, we've been opposed by the democratic machine, but we've used pressure on the streets and within the labor movement to force enough of the Democrats' elected officials to support our positions that we've been able to get these things passed. During Sanders' campaign, Socialist Alternative stressed that in order to win a program of Medicare for all, free college, the Green New Deal, and all of the other programs that Bernie stood for, bearing in mind that one of Bernie's slogans was, billionaires should not exist. These are all policies that are ferociously opposed by the capitalist class. And we stressed that winning them would require building an ongoing movement that was not controlled by the Democratic Party establishment. So we pointed out then, and we continue to point out today, that the road to winning these and other serious reforms would require a new working class party, which would bring together the various social movements that have rocked US capitalism. From Me Too to the youth-led climate strikes, and most recently, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter following the murder of George Floyd. We point out that a new workers' party in the US would not just be an electoral outfit, that the failure of the Green Party and other attempts at founding a workers' party lay largely in their unwillingness to take up campaigns outside of the election cycle. Nevertheless, in 2020, Socialist Alternative called for a vote for Howie Hawkins, who ran as the candidate of the Green Party. Hawkins is a self-described socialist whose program is similar to Sanders, although farther to the left, particularly on foreign policy, where it's actually quite different. We called for a protest vote for Howie Hawkins because he was the candidate of the largest left party that is independent of the Democrats. And that just so happens to be the Green Party. And parenthetically, unlike in Europe, the Green Party here does not embrace neoliberal capitalism. It is seen as the most left-wing party by most Americans. So we're not calling on working class people to join the Green Party and transform it into a new workers' party. We literally said this is a protest vote because we refuse to vote for either of the candidates of big business. The alternative to calling for this protest vote would have been a call to abstain from voting. But this was not been understood as a political act, partly because of the history of a low voter turnout in most US elections. So on the tables, at interventions, in discussions with people about our politics, everyone wants to know who they should vote for. That's absolutely a feature of American politics and belongs to the fact that American politics is so limited to just voting. Also, calling for a protest vote, while it's a modest step, is still a step in the direction of independent working class politics because it undermines the logic of lesser evilism, which has tripped up the development of a mass workers' party so far in our country's history. And to be honest, we did not have much success in convincing people of this position, but it was extremely important for us to put it forward. It has really helped our comrades to develop the capacity to swim against the stream, to not adopt the easy popular position. When doing so, points to what is objectively necessary for the progress of our class, the working class. The conditions that created Trump lie squarely on the shoulders of the Democratic Party. The Republicans and Democrats are both capitalist parties. But if we simply left it at that by saying, as most of the far left do, that both are just the same, that they're just two wings of the same thing. If we left it at that, we would not be able to engage in a dialogue with most working class people. So instead, we argue that only organized mass action using the methods of class struggle can beat back right-wing attacks on the rights of oppressed people, women, people of color, LGBTQ people, especially the youth. And we say this knowing that this will not be the tactic of the Democratic Party. So I want to say something about the rise of the far right and the oft-claimed threat of fascism, the claim that Trump is himself a fascist, rather than, as we would say, a bourgeois politician with authoritarian leanings. We correctly predicted, based on Trump's lack of support from the armed forces and pretty much all of the state machine that he does not directly control, that Trump's rhetoric about refusing to accept the peaceful transfer of power was mostly just that, just empty rhetoric designed to fire up his base. It is true that he's helped to whip up the far right, and he's given cover to white supremacist groups. He's encouraged the growth of the various militia movements, the Proud Boys, and others, which which are of concern to socialists. However, these groups have very little support among the working class. They've remained within the fringe of politics. Back in 2017, there was a real danger that far-right and explicitly fascistic forces could begin to build small but significant organizations. Comrades will remember the murder of Heather Heyer, which followed a torchlit demonstration of right-wing thugs in Charlottesville. In response to the far right at that time, Socialist Alternative in the US worked with other groups to organize mass counter-demonstrations to overwhelm the small groupings of far-right protesters. In Boston, we helped to build a peaceful, union-stewarded march of 40,000 people against the far right. We did not engage in confrontational black bloc tactics, which would have cut us off from engaging and mobilizing people outside of the activist layer. This is how we'll continue to confront the far right, and this approach has been confirmed. While we were among the first groups on the left to call for demonstrations on the 4th yesterday to defend the vote, this call was taken up by significant sections, not only of the left, but also of the more activist-oriented labor unions. So, for example, in Chicago, our posted downtown demonstration last night was taken over by a key ensemble of left-leaning, mainly public sector unions, including the Chicago Teachers Union, who together publicly called for a general strike of all workers if Trump refuses to accept the result of the election. And the fact that this was taken up by these unions after we had been making it for several weeks, I think shows that our perspectives were correct. They were in advance of the movement, but not so far in advance that it would leave us isolated. And last night's demonstration ended up being quite small in Chicago and New York. But I would say that these preemptive calls, because they were echoed in a number of cities, because they were taken up by sections of the labor movement itself, had a significant effect in pushing forward Biden's curiously premature declaration of victory, which came less than an hour before groups on the East Coast and Midwest were assembling demonstrations. I was literally in the bus on the way to the demonstration when I heard Biden's speech, which was very skillfully done, in which he said, we're going to wait for all the votes to be counted, but we believe that when all the votes are counted, I will be the next president of the United States. And then he went to this sort of civility, the kind of unity speech that I will be the, that he said he will be the president of all Americans, not just for the Democrats, and so on. So this speech cut across the movement by reassuring voters who might have turned out that turnout was unnecessary. In other words, millions of people who went to bed the night before, deeply dreading another 4 years of Trump. And I have to admit that included a lot of people, including me and my own family. Nobody was looking forward to another 4 years of this unpredictable, these attacks. That millions of people felt a wave of relief as Biden pointed to his mounting poll numbers in Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada, after Wisconsin had already been declared, to say that he anticipated reaching the magic number of 270. The effect on the demonstration in Chicago was that only a little over 1,000 people showed up, in which, unfortunately, 3 obnoxious Stalinist front groups predominated by handing out free pre-printed signs with slogans like "Refuse Fascism," instead of the mass of ordinary working class people that would have turned out if they felt that the threat was imminent, and who will still turn out, I think, if Trump makes a serious attempt to refuse to leave office. The narrative that Biden is winning is being supported by the vast majority of the media, including many, and I think most at this point, commentators on Fox News. During Election Day and the day after, there was only one report of a major right-wing demonstration, and that was in the solid blue state of California. Today, Trumpsters are demonstrating outside counting places in some swing states, calling with obvious hypocrisy to end the count in some places or to count all the votes in others, depending on the situation. And this adds a comic aspect to Trump's increasingly desperate bluster about court challenges. It's very important to note that he's not getting the support of the Republican establishment in this. And I'll end on these points. We should point out that at this point, Biden's victory, though likely, is still not assured. But we may know by the end of the day. Assuming he's elected, there will be a very brief honeymoon for Biden. His unbending loyalty to Wall Street will become more obvious as he makes his cabinet appointments. This will put a severe strain on those sections of the left, including many in the leadership of DSA, who have not only called for a vote for Biden, but even for Bernie to give up his elected seat in the Senate to become an appointed member of Biden's cabinet. We don't agree with that idea. Against this background, we can anticipate a growing and public impatience with Biden on the part of the environmental movement, which has a very wide support amongst young people, as well as the movements for Black lives, and also sections of the labor movement, which has been under attack via legal assaults on our rights to organize and to represent people in the workplace under the Trump administration. Even more concretely, and especially without a Senate majority, the Biden administration and other Democratic administrations in cities and states across the country will be forced to carry out austerity measures, budget cuts, layoffs of public sector workers, and cuts in services, which will bring out precisely the public sector unions that have shown the most resistance to austerity in the past period. So I'm going to end on that point. Thank you very much, comrades. I really appreciate this invitation.
Dankeschön, Steven, für deine Einleitung. Wir haben bisher noch ganz wenige Fragen nur im Chat. Ich werde jetzt schon mal die erste Frage vorlesen und dann wird Steven da kurz drauf eingehen. Wie schätzt ihr die Gefahr von den rechten Milizen und direkt bewaffnete Konfrontationen mit Linken ein? Wird es nur während der Ergebnisse der Wahl oder haben sie echt eine längerfristige Base?
Es gibt eine zweite Frage. Wie ist deine Einschätzung von Ilhan Omar und AOC und wie schätzt er oder du die Nähe von Omar zum Erdogan-Regime ein?
Steven, willst du erstmal auf die Fragen antworten? Und dann lesen wir den Rest weiter vor.
Es gibt noch eine Frage, genau, die ist gerade reingekommen. Was ist die Perspektive bei einer Biden-Präsidentschaft? Welche Angriffe sind zu erwarten? Was für eine Außenpolitik etc.? Genau, ihr könnt gern weiterhin fragen, aber ansonsten, genau, könnte Steve jetzt die Möglichkeit nutzen, darauf schon mal einzugehen, vielleicht auch ganz angenehm, nicht direkt mit einer Fragenflut konfrontiert zu sein und wir werden weiterhin Fragen sammeln.
Okay, thank you. On the question of the right wing, I think that as I indicated, I think the immediate threat of the right-wing militias it has not materialized so far. There was a serious threat that right-wing militias would show up to intimidate people on election day. That barely happened at all. There's been almost no reports of that. And their attempts to disturb the count are not, so far, do not seem to be at all serious. I think this is, frankly, due to the pressure of those ruling class elements that that Trump and Trump's circle actually listen to, because frankly, the ruling class is far more interested in the stability of their system than they are in keeping Trump in office. I think that going forward, that's a different question, because a Biden administration will fail to solve any of the social problems facing workers and the poor in the United States. And in the absence of a left-wing alternative, then of course we've seen over and over again throughout the history of the 20th century that when a left-wing alternative is cut off, some sections will move towards right-wing ideas, scapegoating of immigrants that we've seen under Trump. So I think that the best response of the labor movement and of the left is to fight for the building of a workers' party, because the Democrats don't offer an alternative. And if the alternative is either the Democrats or the growth of right-wing populism will grow. We have to build a viable mass party, a mass party for working class people. That is what will be our answer to the growth of the right. On the question about AOC's links to Erdogan, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of this. I've heard of links between Tulsi Gabbard and various forces in various places, but I've not heard of this particular thing. And I'm sorry, what was the third question?
I will read it. Jetzt rede ich schon Englisch, ja. Ich lese sie nochmal vor. Was ist die Perspektive bei einer Biden-Präsidentschaft? Welche Angriffe sind zu erwarten? Was für eine Außenpolitik und so weiter?
Fixed it. Well, I think the perspective for a Biden administration is one of probably some limited stimulus package, probably fairly early on, and that might even be passed by the Senate during the interim period. Of course, Biden won't take office, assuming that he is the winner. He won't take office until January 21st. So there's a very open question as to what the Trump administration will continue to do over the next 2.5 months. But it does seem likely, because there's pressure from big business, there's pressure from the real estate, from the landlord lobby for a stimulus package to allow people to pay their rent. So that's a sort of short-term perspective. But I think long-term, Biden is already getting ready to appoint an education secretary who will pursue the same anti-union attacks on public education that were carried out under the Obama administration. You know, a Biden administration is not going to move in the direction of a national health care plan. They've made that absolutely clear. And given that they are not going to have control of the Senate, almost certainly, then, you know, frankly, Biden's claim that he will create a public option to cover more people under Medicaid, that's an untested policy. And unlike Medicare for all, it would be very difficult to organize a mass movement around the idea that more people can get Medicaid. Medicaid being medication for, it's a medical insurance for poor people that most doctors just don't even accept. It's a very bad option. So, I mean, ultimately, the Biden administration is not going to solve any of the problems facing working class people. The perspective for a Biden administration is a perspective for struggle, of working class people having to go out on the streets to demand change. That's why we call for the building of a mass workers' party.
Okay, dann habe ich jetzt noch mal ein paar technische Punkte. Und zwar zum einen braucht die Übersetzung unbedingt eine Pause, weil die nicht hinterherkommen. Das heißt, wir würden jetzt erstmal nicht mehr weitere Fragen stellen, bis die Übersetzung wieder den ganzen Input übersetzt hat. Der zweite Punkt ist, wir werden ja noch eine Diskussion haben. Das heißt, dieses Fragen im Chat war einfach so gedacht, dass ihr kurze Rückfragen stellt und so. Ansonsten keine Beiträge im Chat, keine Riesenfragen im Chat, weil wir werden ja danach einfach noch eine normale Diskussion haben, wo ihr einfach die Fragen selber stellen könnt, wo ihr die Beiträge selber machen könnt. Dann müssen wir das hier nicht alles vorlesen. So, ich glaube, machen wir es am besten so, dass die Übersetzung sich meldet, wenn sie wieder soweit sind. Okay, dann werde ich jetzt die nächste Frage vorlesen. Die Frage ist auf Englisch. Ich werde sie jetzt auf Englisch vorlesen. While the Chicago Teachers Union and others have called for a strike if Trump refuses to cede power, do you think there's the momentum or energy for a general strike to push Biden on issues like police abolition, GND, healthcare, etc.? And how can the left build that momentum for a general strike?
I think that's an excellent question. Certainly at this point, the Chicago Teachers Union, which was allied with UE, which is a small left-wing union, and two locals of the Service Employees International Union. It's not the case that they would be able to call out other unions. They appeal to other unions to join this call. So I think there's also a question as to whether even those unions did very much work within their own ranks to mobilize for strike action. And I think this goes to the historic weakness of the left at this point in time, that, in the past there was a broad activist layer of shop stewards in unionized workplaces who daily defended their members and had the loyalty of their members that they could call on them to undertake strike action. So I would say, the short answer is no, they don't have the momentum to do it at this point. I think it's a political demand. I think it's the correct political demand. But what it points in the direction of is the need to build up that activist layer to rebuild the fighting strength of the labor movement. And I think you can't really separate that from the question of fighting for a new political party. Because at present, frankly, most of the top trade union leaders pay more attention to what the Democratic Party thinks than they do to their own members.
Okay, danke schön, Steven. Wir haben jetzt zwar noch viele Fragen im Chat bekommen, aber ich würde jetzt trotzdem vorschlagen, dass wir den Stream beenden und jetzt nur noch die weitere Veranstaltung in Zoom haben und dass alle Leute, deren Fragen noch nicht beantwortet sind, sich einfach nochmal auf die Redeliste schreiben und ihre Fragen selber vorstellen. Das ist, glaube ich, schöner, als wenn ich hier alles vorlese. In Ordnung, dann hören wir jetzt auf zu streamen auf YouTube und Facebook. Alle Leute, die von da aus zugucken, sind natürlich herzlich eingeladen, uns hier in dem Zoom-Raum noch beizutreten. Genau, also ich würde nochmal vorschlagen, dass alle, deren Fragen noch nicht beantwortet sind, sich im Chat auf die Redeliste schreiben. Dann werden wir euch der Reihe nach dran nehmen. Wir werden doppelt quotieren, also erst Rednerin vorziehen und abwechselnd nach Geschlecht. Und am besten also Fragen kurz halten und für Diskussionsbeiträge später auf 5 Minuten beschränken.
We don't fight racism with racism. We fight racism with solidarity.
But we're not just up against the police. We are up against an entire system that prioritizes profits